to be here with you today. I feel honored to be here and to have been asked, so I hope that we have a good hour. And yes, please ask questions, but don't ask too many. No. Anyway, because I probably have more than an hour's worth here, and I put a lot of things together to give you a good general overview of what I know about resilience, particularly organizational resilience. And so, you know, in many ways, I'm talking to you about something that we all know a little bit about, right? Because we're all human beings. We've all experienced ongoing challenges and disruptions from the pandemic, and, you know, probably still feeling the results of those. And so that's one reason that you know a little bit about it, but you also know a little bit about it because we're all parts of teams and units and organizations and families, et cetera. We oftentimes think of resilience as something that you have or you don't have, like being optimistic or having a particular set of resources or support. But I have to say that over the last almost 35 years now, that I have studied many high-hazard organizations and crises and accidents in industries such as commercial aviation, nuclear power, chemical processing, naval aircraft carrier operations, wildland firefighting, and oil and gas exploration, and of course, patient safety and healthcare, that resilience is a little bit more than that, okay? And so today, a key point that I want you to consider is that it isn't just grand challenges that require resilience. Our organizational lives are fueled by smaller challenges. And from my work, I know that it's the small stuff that can trip us up, okay? When we are inattentive to our context, we create risks to which we have to respond. And so, you know, it's through our relationships, our interactions, our daily patterns of actions that we can become more or less alert to the risks that we're facing, and we can make our roads easier or harder to manage. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. In other words, you know, resilience isn't just something that we have, it's something that we do, okay? And it isn't something that we do just after a crisis or an adverse event. It's something that we do before, during, and after. And so I hope you come away with that perspective today. So I want to do a couple of things. I want to just show you a little bit of the work that I've done over my career. I don't get that opportunity very much, so you know I'd like to just give you some insight about that. And then I'm going to do something that Dr. Kenan just suggested that I do, and to give you a general overview about what we know more generally about resilience, and then I'll dive into the adventure racing that gives us insight about the microdynamics, what people are actually doing, aside from just a list of things that we know contribute to resilience. So we'll see what it looks like on the ground. Okay, so here we go. So I've studied wildland firefighting. In this particular fire, it was the Cerro Grande fire, 2000 was the year. It was, at that time, the largest wildfire that had ever occurred in the United States, with $1 billion worth of damage. It occurred in the Los Alamos Lab, New Mexico area. And it occurred because there were sense-making failures. People overlooked the idea that a 1-inch band of fire that kept creeping along into the grass from the fire, across the fire line, blew this whole fire up. And so people miss things. I studied also, I've done several other studies of wildland firefighting, much bigger studies. In this particular study, what my colleagues and I found is that we thought it was going to be it was a study of adverse events in wildland firefighting across the country. And we thought that we would see that people were missing signals, that something was going wrong and that they acted too late. But that, in fact, wasn't the case. It wasn't a matter of missed signals. It was a matter that people were so embedded in what they were doing that they neglected to really think about updating their story and take different action. We called that dysfunctional momentum, okay? So that was interesting. This is the Bristol Royal Infirmary. Bristol is actually a university and a big hospital system in the UK, about 3 hours away from London. And in the 1980s, the National Health Service in England decided that they wanted to have a set of pediatric cardiac centers of excellence across the country. So they created 15 centers, and one center was at Bristol. And at Bristol, doctors had been working on adults. They hadn't been working on kids. And kids, generally speaking, we're talking about kids with the hearts about the size of a walnut. And so they knew they were going to be on a learning curve, okay? So for the first 2 years that they were in operation, what happened is that their mortality rate was about the same as all of the other centers in the country. But for the next 7 to 10 years after that, their mortality rate was twice the national average, okay? And they, as I said, they kept telling themselves, we're on a learning curve, we've got more complicated cases, et cetera. So there was this cultural belief system that drove their behavior, and finally, there were a number of deaths at one point, and families and families and other people just said, let's stop. Okay, so the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum, it's a national historic site in Baltimore. In 2003, there was an epic snowstorm. And we were trying to understand, how the railroad museum, we wanted to know how they would get going after that, et cetera. And what we found is that I guess we use this as a case to understand what gets learned from rare events, okay? We have many rare events, but how do we know what gets learned? And if it's rare, is it going to be unique, et cetera? We never have to think about this thing again. Okay, so that's another thing. Toyota, unintended acceleration. You may remember about a decade ago, Toyota was having a whole set of accidents in their vehicles. And we think about Toyota. In fact, last night I saw that there is a huge Toyota dealership here. It was quite a building that I saw. But in any event, Toyota didn't really recognize this for quite some time. And arguably, you could say that they're one of the best manufacturing companies ever in the world, but they were slow to recognize that there was something going wrong. They paid several $1 billion in damages, and they had the highest recall ever at that period of time. Okay, Washington Mutual. I don't know if you guys have studied this, but Washington Mutual was the largest savings and loan in the United States. I think it was the first of its kind. And in the Great Recession, it collapsed and went bankrupt. And in essence, I looked at organizational mindlessness there and its effects. And then finally, the issue of patient safety and medical harm. For the last almost 30 years, I have taken a look at patient safety, which resulted in a book that I published a couple of years ago with my late collaborator, Bob Weir's. Patient safety issues are likely to affect all of us in this room at some time or another. They are issues across all of the world and everywhere that you can go. So these are the kinds of things that I've been studying. And you may be saying, well, Kathleen, what the heck? What does this all add up to? Well, when I think about this work, I think about it cosmically, I guess. I think about this question, and that is, how do complex organizations and systems achieve safe, reliable, high-quality, resilient performance under trying conditions? And the reason why I think about these and analyzing these cases is in part because I think they really give us some insight into uncertainty and risk, how they can be managed, and I think that they provide insight also into issues related to resilience. So, because I live by this adage, that things that have never happened before happen all the time. This is I know that some of your professors talk about BP. This was a BP semi-submersible. This is this is how it looked after Hurricane Dennis in 2005. This was called the Thunder Horse. It was 2 times bigger than any other semi-submersible of its kind. So it was a new thing. And you're probably sitting there and you're saying, okay, Hurricane Dennis, hurricane probably did something to, either break it, they got water in or whatever. That's not what happened. Essentially, during the construction of this, there was a check valve that was installed backward, and it caused water to flood into the semi-submersible rather than out of. And this was almost $1 billion worth of damage as well. So whether, this happened, or whether you are Johns Hopkins and probably UNC Hospital, or maybe Duke or whatever, things that have never happened happen all the time. I think this really helps us see that I don't think we're really good at predicting big risks and big things going wrong. I believe that we have to pay attention to what is in front of us and to think about those issues and to manage those, and that's how we become resilient. We have to be able to cope with unanticipated dangers before they come in with us, after they come in with us, whatever. So, okay, so let me just tell you where we're going here. Just some orienting questions. So in the next hour, well, I don't know how much time we have, and I don't have a clock, but you do have since I'm going to stand over on this side, I will go over here. Thank you for being patient with me. So what I want to do right now is just talk about, what do we know about resilience, generally speaking? And then what are some of the microdynamics? And then I want to leave you with some intriguing questions and intrigues that I think really come up as a consequence of doing all this research. So to ask you, well, maybe I should cover this up. Oh, I can't do that. I'm sorry. Okay, well, I don't know how to get that off, but that will go off in the next one. Okay, thank you, Camille. I appreciate that. And that's the relational part of it too. So, okay, so I mean, if you didn't see this, think, just look at me. Don't look at that. How would you think about resilience? Anybody want to say? I mean, what does resilience mean? Whatever. What definition would come to your mind? Yeah? You take a guess? Or what would you think? What would you say?
I looked, but what I saw was consistent with ability to spring back.
Okay. Ability to spring back. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Other people, what comes to your mind? Did everybody think that?
Being able to pivot quickly.
I'm sorry?
Being able to pivot quickly.
Okay, being able to adapt, pivot quickly.
To flourish under harsh circumstances.
Okay, flourish under harsh circumstances. Yeah.
I think of it as not necessarily like flourishing would be amazing, but just being able to be resilient in situations where you're unable to flourish and then putting yourself in a position to flourish afterwards.
Okay, so to withstand adversity over time, perhaps to grow and develop, to be able to handle something better in the future. Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely.
Adaptive durability.
The active durability?
Adaptive.
Oh, adaptive durability, meaning that you're going to constantly do it, or what's the durability piece?
Durability piece is maintaining the optimal status quo. The status quo that, given the lack of some sort of extenuating circumstance, you would maintain. But adaptability is to recognize when there are factors that may negatively impact that and compensate for that to maintain that durable status quo.
Okay, all right. So yeah, to be able to adapt and to be able to endure and to be able to do that over and over, to be able to sustain a particular level of performance. Yes, I mean, all of those things are true. And really, I mean, trying to seek a consensus over what it means, I don't think is really realistic, because it means a lot of things. These are the kinds of definitions that traditionally come up over and over. Springing back, recovering without breaking, absorbing strain and preserving functioning within a particular bound. the ability to learn and grow, not the idea that you would necessarily face the next period successfully, but that it would make you more able to possibly face the next period. So all of these come up, and I think they have multiple images for us. You know, the idea of well, I saw on the prior slide the idea of springing back, bouncing back, but the idea of also absorbing strain, right, from the physical sciences, the handling of challenging conditions to make you more prepared, as I said earlier. So I think when we talk about resilience, I think we have to think about a couple of essential questions. And I don't think people do this a lot, but I like to think about it just to set the stage. As we talk, and I talk more about what we find in the literature, you know, you might want to keep these things in mind, because I don't know that these are ever going to be answered in a single way. But the idea, you know, what's the basic essence of resilience? Is it a capability? Is it a process? Is it a trait? You know, is it a capacity? Is it fixed or malleable? I mean, I think of all these questions here, the one thing I do know, it is not fixed. And to say that it is fixed is, I think, a bad thing, because it implies then that human beings don't have any way to get out of that, right? If we say that it's fixed. So I think that's important. But the question is, you know, I think these other two questions are really critical, and I think critical for your year of looking at resilience. You know, how much adversity is required? Does it come after some major event? Does it come, you know, I mean, and is it a rare event that we think about it, or is it in response to ongoing strain? Which I happen to think that we have a response to a wider range of disruptions. And when is it most important? No, I mean, I tried to signal at the beginning of this talk that I think it's not just after that it comes. I think it's before, because I think that it is a process. And that, as I said, I think that we can make our roads easier, harder to manage. And so just keep these things in mind as we go forward. Okay, so this is what I love. I love to think about, you know, how we arrived at this. And, you know, resilience has an incredible appeal across disciplines, across the physical and social sciences, for example. Here's an engram that shows you the rise in the word, or I think I used either business resilience or organizational resilience, although it doesn't show up there. But maybe it was just resilience here. But anyway, you could see that really it took off after 9/11. That's how I think about it, is that there have been much more attention since then. You see a little blip right here after the mid-1940s, et cetera. I attribute that to World War II and perhaps the introduction of man's search for meaning by Viktor Frankl. But anyway, so that's just across disciplines. But if you look at within disciplines, just a quick engram, we see, you know, you can see the term organizational, individual, team, and occupational resilience. And I think that gives you some insight that there are differences there as well. So it does have broad appeal within organization theory, as I said. And what some of the really interesting things that we know is, number one, that some of the research at the individual level shows that, what was I going to say? That individuals who are deemed to be more resilient on using particular scales, that they are more committed and that they are more satisfied with their organization, more likely to stay, et cetera. So that's at the individual level. At the occupational resilience, there is not very much literature on that, but the literature that is in existence suggests that you need to have resilience, particularly in particular occupations. And in fact, for example, you know, teachers, I know this sounds weird, but you can think about it in elementary schools or in middle schools and perhaps in high schools, that teachers, you know, have a wider range of resilience capacities that they need to demonstrate, both cognitive, emotional, physical, et cetera. Whereas, for example, accountants, They only have a narrower range of things in which, they don't require as broad a range of resilience that others might need in other disciplines. And then organizational resilience, we'll talk about that in a second, but that is broad appeal. So let me just talk a little bit about what we know about the underpinnings of individual resilience. In the last decade, I have conducted several systematic reviews and analyses of the literature to get a sense of what is the literature telling us about resilience. And with respect to individual resilience, which is not really something that I'm studying a lot, but just looking at the literature broadly, what do we see? We see a couple of things. One of the things that we see, and it isn't necessarily up here, is that there are just recently some studies of healthcare workers, and these studies are showing that perhaps there is a personality trait pattern. And I think about this as motherhood and apple pie, but only because it suggests that the personality trait pattern for highly resilient people shows that they're mature, responsible, optimistic, persevering, and cooperative. And so I can't think of any other better terms that, than to describe somebody who has all those things. But anyway, the other literature is pretty clear that resilience is not necessarily something you have. You might have this personality trait, but resilience is something that you do. But these 4 things show up in the literature on resilience, and that is, the first thing is that you want to stare down reality. That people who are more resilient are able to do that. They're not overly confident and they're not overly cautious. They're able to self-regulate. They have multiple emotions that change over time. They have a deep belief that life is meaningful, and that comes from their relationships. We know about positive psychology, et cetera. It comes from support. Improvisation is a critical aspect of resilience, the idea that you can make do and you can repurpose and you can reconfigure particular skills and capabilities that you have to apply it to the situation. And then finally, there is more recent information or more recent research suggesting that another element of resilience is really physical and mental hardiness, and the idea that you have to take care of those parts of yourself, and so those things, as I said, show up. So that's the underpinnings of individual resilience. Let me just talk a little bit about occupational. I think actually this is really pretty interesting. These data come from Cossack and Perugino, and we're using Department of Labor data and looking at these occupations. They examined 1,000 occupations, and they created this system of looking at what is required. You have to be cognitive skills, emotional skills, physical skills. And interestingly enough, they said that dancers are the #1 occupation in the need for resilience, okay? Which I think is interesting. They said models was at the bottom. So models don't need that much resilience, that's what they said. But dancers do, and having a good friend who is a dance professor, I can tell you that's probably true. They do need to be resilient. The other thing is that, for example, people in doctors and nurses, they were in like the top 10 to 15% for the need for resilience. When you look at this top chart, what you're seeing is the kinds of capabilities that are required. And for example, you can see that firefighters and nurses, they have the most task demands, and firefighters and nurses, I think this is really weird because they didn't, either the Department of Labor or Ellen Cossack and Matthew didn't consider this, but I think it was the Department of Labor, they didn't say that nurses had any physical demands, which I think is just not true. So I think this, could be redone. But there are cognitive and emotional demands for people in healthcare, and you can see where other people lie. So I think that's what we know, and we don't know that much about occupational resilience. When we look at the literature on organizations, we see a little bit of a different pattern. We see that there are two major perspectives that come to mind. The first perspective is this idea that resilience is exhibited in that it's something that you have a trade, or you have resources, or you have endowments or capacities, and that you can use after an adverse period or adverse event occurred. So resilience is something that we have. At the same time, other research, in particular research that I and colleagues and other people that I know in the field have done, suggests that resilience is more than that. Is that it's something that we do, and we do it through the ways in which we relate with one another. We do it through necessary processes and actions that we take, and that resilience isn't something that just comes after, it comes before, okay? So I'm gonna show you this next slide, and I'm aware of time is a wasting, so anyway, so what endowments and what are you going to see? I think there are probably things that you're going to be hearing about this next year. What shows up repeatedly in the literature are these kinds of things. The resources, for example, organizations that have more slack are potentially more resilient. Things like vision and a goal, organizations that kind of know where they're going and can give people some direction, have deep expertise, they're more resilient, in part because we know that deep expertise enables organizations, enables human beings to be able to improvise. You have to improvise on something. You've got to know things in order to improvise. Behavioral capabilities, emotional capabilities, relational capabilities, all of these things show up in the literature repeatedly. The kinds of processes, communicating and coordinating, contextualizing, helping people understand where we are right now, and how do we make sense of this, meaning making, etc. The list goes on and on, I can tell you. And I have to say, I'm not really interested in lists. So what I want to do is dive into what are we actually going to see on the ground, okay? And I want to get into adventure racing, as I know we're not going to have enough time to do that and questions, but we will go. So here we are, adventure racing. So these are some adventure racers. As Dr. Kenan talked about, it's a multidisciplinary sport in which teams navigate over an unmarked terrain, and they do three things, generally speaking. Sometimes they also do another one, but they trek, they bike, and they paddle. Sometimes they mountain climb. Oftentimes they mountain climb too because they have to climb up terrain. So anyway, why do we choose this context? We chose it in part because, it was really a way of seeing something unfold under adversity. Researchers it's not common that you have the opportunity to be able to see something unfold, and we wanted to understand the microdynamic processes, and that's what we were looking at, and we had this opportunity. So this was an inductive study with my collaborator, Michelle Barton. We observed races, we conducted, and I didn't put this up there, but we did pre and post race interviews with 103 racers from 53 teams, et cetera. You can see the rest of it. We did a very elaborate analysis using grounded theory, looking at particular cases. When we looked at our sample after we recruited people, we found that we oftentimes had interviews with several people from the same team. And so that enabled us to take a look at 59 race segments for which we had data from 2 or more team members. So it was, I think we did a really good job in explaining this in our paper, and I can let you do that. But let me just say a couple more words on adventure racing. Teams engage in one mode of what they're doing until they get to a checkpoint, okay? And that's the goal in this, is that there are checkpoints that are over this unmarked territory. People can't use GPS. You only use a map that you're given. The map can be out of date, which it often is. The terrain could change because, you know, trees fall down or there are fires or whatever, so you never know what you're going to get. But anyway, teams do one mode, then they come to what's called a transition area where things have been put. So like if they're going to bike, their bikes have been put there for them, and they, you know, so then they end one leg and then they go to the other. And the way that teams are judged is by the number of checkpoints that they get, okay? So you don't have to get every checkpoint, but at the end, you're going to be evaluated on 2 things. One is how much time did you take, and 2 is how many checkpoints did you get, okay? So this is what we learned. First of all, we learned that there are 2 types of contextual challenges, 2 types of adversity. The first was just the ongoing strain. The ongoing strain of trying to operate in a very uncertain and a dynamic environment, okay? The second thing was that there were acute shocks. Every single team reported that they had a number of acute shocks regardless of how great the team was, et cetera. So there was that. The second thing that we found is that there were 2 ways that they dealt with these particular forms of stress, okay? And that's what I want to talk to you about right now. Let me just say a couple of other words that I have here, is that, as I said, there's no specified route. So all of the teams have to figure out how they're going to do this, and they don't all do it the same way, okay? They're given the coordinates on where they can find the CP, but, you know, you have to be looking, because it could be anywhere. It could be in a tree. You just don't know where it's going to be. They can only navigate by compass and maps. Physical fitness is important, but it's not the most important thing, okay? Because think about this. We often saw that less physically fit teams oftentimes did better because they were good on navigating, they were good on decision making, they were good on problem solving, and they were great on team relating, okay? So just so you know that. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about this ongoing strain. This is what a map looked like, okay? You can see the map here, and you can see these red things are the CPs. I didn't ask the question, but I should have asked, are there any adventure racers in here? Phew. Okay, no, no, I'm teasing. No, I would have liked to have been one, but I'm not. But anyway, so what happens when you get the CP, you can see this person here is punching a card. So that's how you show that you got a checkpoint, is that there's a punch with each one of the CPs, and it's a different shape, and they punch their ticket, and then they show that when they get to the end of the race. So think about, I think you should be thinking about this for your whole year of the grand challenge of uncertainty and risk. And that is that performance in an uncertain dynamic context is it's a situation-specific accomplishment. What I mean by that is that the meaning and experience is going to change over time. It's always going to be different from one minute to the next. It's hard work to manage, okay? So, for example, these were some of the questions that we saw people asking, does this trail on the map still exist? Is Mary slowing pace mean that she's going to drop out, or is she going to work through it? etc. So we saw racers talking about all of these things, you know, and how can we not kill each other? Yeah, that was actually a big one. So here we are. So how did these teams manage ongoing strain, realizing that ongoing strain and acute shocks were handled differently, which we thought was pretty interesting. This is what we saw with ongoing strain. Let me just tell you this. People started the race with a minimal sensible structure. By minimal sensible structure, I mean this, is that each team had a navigator, that was somebody who got the map and who had to figure out where we are and, you know, where we're going to go, how we're going to do it. So there was a navigator. The second role, there was a mule. I know it's a terrible term, but in any event, it was the person who was strong and was going to be able to carry stuff. And then oftentimes there was a cheerleader if there were 3 people or more on the team, okay? So people started out, you know, the team started out, they had their temporary structure, and they started engaging with the context. And what I mean by that is that, you know, they were going their way. They might have missed a clue here or whatever, but, you know, for the most part, in the first leg, and as people were starting the race, although we saw some teams go bad immediately, you know, for the most part, teams were communicating and coordinating and, you know, really aware of where we are, and so, you know, they're making sense of what's happening, and they may make some changes, but things are going along okay. And then they start to get a little tired, or they experience a setback. They didn't see a milestone. All of a sudden, they're in the thicket of some horrible weed that, you know, is everybody's itching now, and there are thorns all over. It's horrible. And so things start kind of going bad. All right. So what starts to happen? There are some key challenges to being able to, as I recall, let me just say, being able to say, you know, have the structure, engage with the context. And what I mean by engaging with the context, really paying attention to where we are here and now. There's a really good sense of, we know where we are. We're bringing the map and our experience together, you know, or we're on track. So, you know, we're fueling our future, right? We're not making it harder. But something goes wrong, and then we stop communicating. And then we don't know where we are. We don't make any changes to, you know, like our navigator's getting a little tired or something like that. We don't say, well, let's help you, or we want somebody else to do that. So, you know, we don't take action, we don't restructure, and we've got the same structure, and it's just making us worse over time. So you see what we're trying to say. And so this changing abilities to enact one's role was a big challenge. People didn't, you know, they couldn't do what they were supposed to do, and things started to fall apart if roles weren't reconfigured, okay? The second challenge to mitigating strain was disengaging. As communication got worse, these are the bad teams, because the good teams actually handled these things pretty well. As communication got worse, as roles changed, and people had no sense of what they were supposed to be doing, people became disengaged. In this particular example, this team got lost pretty immediately, and what happened is the navigator said, I think we should just follow the team in front of us, okay? And nobody else really, they didn't like that. Their roles, like paying attention to the context, et cetera, were taken away from them. And seriously, this team was just following, and this person said, you know, they didn't have any idea where they were, what they were doing, they were just going. And this team, unfortunately, fell quite apart. It was bad. And so there was this disengagement. Disengagement meant that people were not doing their role, or they didn't have a role. It didn't even have to be their role. It could be, you know, a reconfigured role. They weren't doing it. They weren't engaged. They weren't paying attention to the context. They weren't communicating. So, you know, things just started to get off track. drift away from, and what I meant by drift is people's conception of where they were and where they were actually were totally not connected. So people got way off track, okay, as you can see from this. I mean, and people wish they were wherever they were, but they weren't. Okay, so anyway, so you see what happened here, and I know I'm making it really simplistic, but and it's much more complex, but because we have limited time, that's what I'm doing. Okay, so in addition to this ongoing strain, let me just say this. Taking care of ongoing strain was critical because everybody was facing it. And that if you weren't handling this strain well enough, it made it much more difficult to handle the acute shocks. Okay, so the ongoing strain was really important to handle it. As I said, shocks were many, and everybody experienced them. We thought about it as bees, bears, and drunk hunters. And because really, we did see, because teams recorded that, told us that's what happened. But anyway, there were a lot of things that went wrong. And there were 3 strategies that enabled teams to resolve these acute shocks: compiling resources, redistributing strain, and reframing meaning. And let me just show you a few quotes from there. And we saw these in the most resilient teams, that they resolved the problems by compiling resources. In this case, a person on this one team, his derailleur broke. I don't know anything about bikes, but evidently they have these derailleurs. And it snapped off, and he said he thought the race was done. Within seconds, his team stepped up, and they started working it. I mean, somebody tipped over the bike. Somebody had that tool that, I can't remember the name of it, but the tool that has like every possible tool in it. What is it? The Leatherman. I'm sorry. Okay, I put it in there and then I forgot. Okay, so anyway, they just started working on it, and everybody pitched in, and they were able to get it back together and move on. Redistributing strain. I mean, this was a case where the team wasn't expecting to spend the night on this mountain, but they slowed down and something happened. They didn't have any gear, and it got really, really cold, and so they shared their clothing. This was another one, another person who was really slowing down, and the team wasn't sure whether they were going to be able to go out, to be able to get through it, and they all pitched in. Somebody, took his socks off and looked at his foot blisters, and I mean, it's pretty graphic, as you can see. And the other thing is that they had to reframe meaning, especially when things weren't going the way that they were expecting. And this was a team that really thought that they were going to win this race. They were so into it, and they realized that that wasn't going to happen. And as this informant said, he said, we realized that we're not really going to be able to overtake a few teams, and basically we're not going to look over our shoulders. We're going to look at the team in front of us and capitalize on their mistakes. So that's what they said. This other one, this was an amazing women's team, and one person had gotten really sick. The other person had flown over the handlebars of her bike, and she had really done a bad thing to her leg. And you can see from this example that her teammate, was running the bikes back and forth for that, and they had 2 more mountains to go up. And they actually made it to the end of the race. So they reframed meaning about this. We weren't racing for the podium. We're just doing this for ourselves, right? Okay. So let me just say one thing that was critical to all of this, and I think it's critical to resilience, and that is a prerequisite for being able to handle acute shocks was a communal orientation. People were not blaming each other. They were saying, this is happening to all of us. So a communal orientation was critical to diffusing the effects of adversity, right? And bearing the burden together really strengthened resilience. Because when that didn't happen, and there were plenty of teams where people blamed each other, what happened is people just disengaged. They stopped paying attention, they didn't communicate with the team, and basically things fell apart. So this is our model, that you have this ongoing strain that is affected by our engaging with the context, making sense of what we're facing, restructuring if we need to, that feeds into this connecting and communicating, and then we have to deal with the process of recovery and from acute shocks. So what do we learn? I think that the microdynamics of resilience, I think it reinforces this idea of resilience is something we do, and we do it together. It involves interpersonal behaviors. It requires this ongoing strain and acute shocks, and communal coping is central to it. And one thing that I haven't had time to really write about yet, and that I'm really interested in, is that impermanence was a very important element here. Teams often talked about the fact that, things are not going to last forever. And there was a focus on the teams that were really thinking about impermanence, that we want to focus on what's left, not what's lost. And I think there's more to be said about that, and I'd like to do that in the future. So let me just end. You will have 5 minutes to ask questions. So let me end with a couple of intrigues that I think that this points to. Okay. One is, I think we do have to think about the temporal aspects of resilience. And I think some people are starting to write about that, particularly in resilience engineering work. I haven't seen it show up yet. Well, I mean, I think I and some colleagues wrote about this in Academy of Management Annals in 2017. The idea that resilience can take many forms, and it doesn't occur just after, it occurs before, during, and after. And what distinguishes each one of these, I don't know, but we need to think about that. There are negative aspects to resilience, and I don't think that we've studied that enough. We know that when people are highly resilient, they sometimes have very positive views of themselves and their self-conception. And that might be incompatible with honest acknowledgement that they have weaknesses and that they need to learn. And it also can affect their attention and to signals that things are going wrong. If you're overly optimistic, you may not pay attention to something negative and scary. We know from the team literature that teams that have had near misses, that they're more likely to take risky actions in the future. I think that's pretty interesting. This one, I think, is really the important one, especially for organization and management scholars, and that is that from the nursing context, healthcare, we know that nurses are wildly resilient. Every day they have to do workarounds. I mean, there are always missing resources, missing communication, missing this and that. They don't have everything on hand, and they never will, and we need to understand that. They're remarkable. And at the same time, when you're remarkable and you're constantly revising things and improvising, people at the top of the organization don't necessarily learn about that there are all of these constraints. And so I think it inhibits system change and stifles system solutions. I think the final thing, though, I want to leave for you, and I think this is important for the year of grand challenges, and that is that I don't think organizations are doing enough to really understand. We've been thinking about how do we create resilience, but I don't think we're thinking about the other side. How do we really prevent organizational vulnerability? And from my research, what I have found is that vulnerability comes from mundane organizational imperfections. And I think two sources. One is, these ideas that people stop following routines, they stop carrying out procedures in the way that they need to. Compliance is there's failures in compliance and all of these other kinds of things, which I've seen in the literature. And then I think the managerial part of that is that managers don't want to know, or leaders don't necessarily want to know. They experience the fallacy of centrality, the idea that, if I don't know about something, it must not be happening, okay? because if it was happening, I would know about it. But so I think it prevents them from being curious. And I have to say, yes, I have seen that more than once. Anyway, so I leave you with that. I'm happy to answer questions in the next 2 minutes, but I appreciate your attention, and it was great to be with you today. So thank you very much.